It was a quiet evening as Judge Olivia Carter drove home after a long day at the courthouse. The day had been exhausting, filled with hearings and paperwork, but Olivia felt satisfied knowing she had done her best. Her job as a judge was demanding, but she took pride in serving her community with fairness and respect. As she drove through a peaceful suburban neighborhood, her mind wandered to the relaxing evening she had planned, dinner and some time reading her favorite book. The quiet night was interrupted by the sudden flash of blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. A police car signaled for her to pull over. Olivia's heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm. She wasn't speeding, and her car was in perfect condition. There was no reason for concern, or so she thought. Pulling over to the side of the road, she rolled down her window and waited for the officer to approach. A tall, stern-looking man stepped out of the police car. His uniform was neatly pressed, and his badge glinted under the streetlights. As he approached Olivia's car, his expression was serious, almost confrontational. "License and registration," he said without any greeting. Olivia nodded politely and reached for her wallet. "Of course, officer. May I ask what this is about?" she asked calmly. The officer, whose badge read Blake, ignored her question. "Just hand over your documents," he replied sharply. Olivia handed him her license and registration, keeping her composure despite the officer's rude tone. Officer Blake glanced at her ID briefly, but it was clear he hadn't noticed her title as a judge. "This your car?" he asked, his tone filled with suspicion. "Yes, it is," Olivia answered, her voice steady. "Is there a problem?" Blake smirked slightly, leaning closer to her window. "You're driving a luxury car through this neighborhood. That's enough reason to check things out." Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't respond to his comment. Instead, she stayed quiet, watching as Blake walked back to his patrol car, her documents in hand. He appeared to make a call on his radio, and moments later, another police car arrived. Olivia couldn't help but feel uneasy as two more officers stepped out and joined Blake in a hushed conversation. She could see from their body language that they were assuming the worst about her. Their glances in her direction, the occasional shake of their heads, it was clear they didn't believe she belonged there. Olivia felt a mix of frustration and disbelief. She was a judge, a well-respected member of the legal system, yet here she was, being treated as though she had done something wrong. When Blake returned, his questions became even more pointed. "What brings you to this area?" he asked, his tone cold. "I live nearby," Olivia replied evenly. "And again, officer, may I ask what I'm being stopped for?" Blake ignored her question once more, his attitude becoming more condescending. "You're acting awfully defensive for someone who claims they've done nothing wrong." Olivia took a deep breath, reminding herself to remain calm. She knew this wasn't about anything she had done. It was about assumptions that had nothing to do with her character or actions. As the minutes ticked by, Olivia decided she had heard enough. It was time to remind these officers who she was. But she would wait for the right moment. For now, she remained composed, knowing this encounter would soon take an unexpected turn. As Judge Olivia Carter sat in her car, waiting for Officer Blake to finish his supposed investigation, she couldn't help but notice how the situation was escalating unnecessarily. Blake and the other officers whispered among themselves, glancing her way occasionally with suspicion. Olivia stayed calm, but her patience was wearing thin. She knew she had done nothing wrong, yet she was being treated like a suspect. A small group of neighbors began to gather nearby, curious about the flashing lights and the scene unfolding on their usually quiet street. Olivia could feel their eyes on her, some filled with curiosity and others with judgment. It was frustrating, but she reminded herself to keep her composure. She knew better than to let her emotions get the best of her in a situation like this. Officer Blake returned to her window, his tone more condescending than before. "We're still checking things out," he said. "But tell me again, why are you in this neighborhood?" Olivia kept her voice steady. "As I mentioned earlier, officer, I live nearby. I was on my way home." Blake raised an eyebrow, clearly not believing her. "This car," he said, gesturing at her vehicle, "doesn't really seem like it belongs to someone who lives around here." Olivia blinked, surprised by his audacity. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Officer, is there a specific reason you've stopped me? If I've broken a traffic law or if there's an issue with my vehicle, I'd like to know." Blake smirked. "You seem awfully eager to deflect. Is there something you're not telling us?" At that moment, one of the other officers walked up to Blake, whispering something in his ear. Blake nodded and turned back to Olivia. "We're going to need you to step out of the car." Olivia raised an eyebrow, but complied, unbuckling her seatbelt and opening the door. She stood tall, her professional demeanor unwavering despite the growing tension. "May I ask why you need me to step out of the vehicle?" she inquired. Blake crossed his arms, his posture exuding authority. "It's standard procedure when we have questions about a driver's story." Olivia's patience was nearly gone. She had dealt with all kinds of people in her courtroom: liars, manipulators, and those who tried to hide their wrongdoing. But this situation was different. She wasn't on trial. She was being treated unfairly based on assumptions. As the officers continued to scrutinize her, Olivia decided it was time to take control of the situation. She cleared her throat, drawing their attention. "Officers, I've complied with everything you've asked, but I think it's time you take a closer look at my identification." Blake frowned, clearly not expecting her to push back. "We've already seen your ID," he said dismissively. "Not carefully enough," Olivia replied firmly. She reached into her purse, retrieved her ID again, and held it up for them to see. "My name is Judge Olivia Carter. I am a sitting judge for the state court." The officers froze, their expressions shifting from suspicion to shock. Blake's confidence faltered as he processed her words. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Olivia held her ground, her calm demeanor now underscored by a quiet authority. The power dynamic had shifted, and the officers knew it. The bystanders watching the scene seemed equally stunned. Whispers spread through the small crowd as Olivia continued, her voice steady. "Now, officers, would you like to explain why you've stopped me and treated me with such disrespect?" Blake stammered, his face turning red. For the first time, Olivia saw uncertainty in his eyes. The tables had turned, and the next move was hers. The air felt heavy with tension as Judge Olivia Carter stood outside her car, her calm yet authoritative presence now commanding the attention of everyone around her. The officers, who had been so confident moments earlier, now looked uncertain. Officer Blake, in particular, seemed to struggle to find his words. His usual arrogance had been replaced by visible discomfort as he processed the revelation that the woman he had been questioning was, in fact, a judge. "Judge Carter." One of the younger officers repeated softly, his eyes widening. He glanced at Blake, as if seeking guidance on what to do next. Blake, however, seemed frozen, his confidence shaken by Olivia's quiet declaration. "Yes, Judge Olivia Carter," Olivia said firmly, holding her state-issued ID in front of her once again. "Now, I believe I asked a question earlier that still hasn't been answered. What exactly is the reason for this stop?" Blake cleared his throat, his usual commanding tone now faltering. "Well, it was just a routine check," he stammered. "You know, to ensure everything's in order." Olivia raised an eyebrow, her expression one of calm skepticism. "A routine check," she repeated, pulling me over, questioning why I'm in this neighborhood, and implying that my car doesn't belong to me doesn't sound like a routine check. It sounds like something else entirely. Blake's face turned red as he struggled to respond. The small crowd of bystanders watching the scene began whispering among themselves. Some shook their heads in disapproval, while others looked on with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Olivia could feel their eyes on her, but she remained composed. Another officer stepped forward, attempting to defuse the situation. "Judge Carter, we didn't mean any disrespect," he said quickly. "We were just following protocol." "Protocol?" Olivia asked, her voice calm but firm. "If this is your protocol, then I believe it needs serious reevaluation, Because what I've experienced tonight is not protocol. It's profiling. The officer looked down, clearly unsure how to respond. Olivia continued, addressing all of them. I've dedicated my career to upholding justice and ensuring that everyone is treated fairly under the law. What I've witnessed tonight is the exact opposite of that. Blake finally spoke up, his voice quieter than before. We didn't know who you were. Olivia's gaze sharpened. And that's the problem. Officer Blake, you shouldn't have to know who I am to treat me with respect. Every person, no matter who they are or what they look like, deserves to be treated fairly. Your duty is to serve and protect, not to judge and assume. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly realizing the gravity of the situation. Blake mumbled an apology, though it lacked sincerity. I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding. Olivia remained composed, her voice steady but resolute. This is about more than a misunderstanding. This is about accountability. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the department, and I'll make sure this incident is thoroughly investigated. Blake and the other officers nodded silently, knowing there was nothing they could say to undo the damage. The crowd of bystanders began to disperse, some murmuring words of support for Olivia as they left. As Olivia returned to her car, she felt a mix of emotions, frustration, exhaustion, but also determination. This wasn't just about her. It was about standing up against a system that allowed such behavior to persist. And Olivia was ready to fight for the change that was long overdue. As Judge Olivia Carter sat in her car, the quiet of the now dispersed crowd gave her a moment to think. The tension from the confrontation still lingered, but she wasn't shaken. She had spent years facing challenges in the courtroom and knew how to stay composed under pressure. However, this experience was different. It was personal, and it exposed a much larger issue that couldn't be ignored. Before driving away, Olivia picked up her phone and began taking notes about the encounter. She wanted every detail to be fresh in her mind when she filed her complaint. From the officer's initial rude tone to the baseless questioning about her car, Olivia documented everything. Her legal training had taught her the importance of accuracy, and she was determined to ensure this incident wouldn't be swept under the rug. That night, Olivia sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, drafting an official complaint to the police department. As she typed, she couldn't help but reflect on the broader implications of what had happened. If this could happen to her, a judge who knew her rights and had the resources to fight back, what about the people who didn't? How many others had faced similar treatment but felt powerless to speak out? The next morning, Olivia submitted her complaint and reached out to a trusted colleague, a civil rights attorney named Marcus. She explained the situation, and Marcus immediately offered his support. This is bigger than just one incident, he said. We need to use this as a chance to bring attention to the issue of profiling and bias in law enforcement. Together, they planned their next steps. Marcus suggested holding a press conference to share Olivia's story with the public. At first, Olivia hesitated. She wasn't someone who sought the spotlight, but she realized the importance of speaking out. If her story could spark change, it was worth it. The press conference was scheduled for the following day. Word spread quickly, and by the time Olivia stepped up to the podium, a crowd of reporters, community leaders, and supporters had gathered. Cameras flashed as Olivia began to speak, her voice steady and clear. Last night, I was stopped by officers who assumed I didn't belong in my own neighborhood, she began. Despite showing them my identification and remaining respectful, I was treated with suspicion and disrespect. This isn't just about me. This is about a pattern of behavior that affects countless people in our community. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. As a judge, I've dedicated my life to justice and fairness, but what I experienced last night was neither. It's time for accountability. It's time for change. The crowd erupted in applause, and reporters began asking questions. Olivia answered thoughtfully, emphasizing the need for training, oversight, and systemic reform in law enforcement. She made it clear that her goal wasn't to punish the officers involved, but to create a system where such incidents wouldn't happen in the first place. By the end of the press conference, Olivia felt a sense of relief. Speaking out had been difficult, but it was necessary. As she walked away from the podium, she knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be challenging, but Olivia was ready. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The days following Judge Olivia Carter's press conference were a whirlwind of activity. Her story quickly gained national attention, sparking conversations about racial profiling and the need for police reform. Messages of support poured in from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had faced similar experiences. Olivia was touched by the overwhelming response, but she knew this wasn't just about her. It was about creating real change. The police department responded to Olivia's complaint by launching an internal investigation. Officer Blake and the other officers involved were placed on administrative leave while the incident was reviewed. Meanwhile, the department faced mounting pressure from the public and local leaders to address the broader issues Olivia had highlighted. Olivia spent her days balancing her work as a judge with her newfound role as an advocate. She met with community organizations, attended town hall meetings, and spoke with lawmakers about implementing policies to prevent bias in law enforcement. Her focus wasn't on punishing individuals, but on fixing the system that allowed such behavior to thrive. One of the first steps Olivia advocated for was mandatory bias training for all officers. Understanding and addressing bias isn't optional, she said during a meeting with local officials. It's essential if we want to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the community. She also pushed for the creation of an independent oversight board to review complaints against officers. This board, she argued, would ensure transparency and accountability, giving the community confidence that their concerns would be taken seriously. At the same time, Olivia continued to work closely with her lawyer friend Marcus, who helped her navigate the legal and political aspects of her advocacy. Together, they organized a community forum where people could share their experiences and propose solutions. The event was a success, drawing a diverse crowd and fostering open, honest dialogue. During the forum, Olivia listened as others shared their stories of discrimination and unfair treatment. Some spoke with anger, others with sadness, but all shared a desire for change. Olivia felt a renewed sense of purpose as she realized how many people were counting on her to keep fighting. Amid the momentum for reform, Olivia faced her own challenges. Some critics accused her of overreacting, while others dismissed her efforts as unlikely to succeed. But Olivia refused to be discouraged. She reminded herself of the countless people who had reached out to thank her, and she used their stories as fuel to keep going. The investigation into the officers' actions concluded with a public apology from the police chief. While the department stopped short of admitting systemic issues, they committed to working with Olivia and other community leaders to implement reforms. Officer Blake, however, resigned from his position, citing personal reasons. Though the resolution was far from perfect, it was a step in the right direction. Olivia knew there was still much work to be done, but she felt hopeful for the first time in weeks. Her story had sparked a movement, and she was determined to see it through. As she sat in her chambers one evening, reviewing cases for the next day, Olivia received a text from Marcus. It was a simple message. "You're making a difference. Don't stop now." Olivia smiled, feeling a sense of pride and determination. This was just the beginning, and she was ready to keep fighting for justice, one step at a time. Months had passed since Judge Olivia Carter's encounter with Officer Blake, but the effects of that night were still rippling through her community. The changes she had advocated for were beginning to take shape, though she knew the road to meaningful reform would be long and challenging. Her story had inspired many, and Olivia had embraced her role as both a judge and a voice for justice. One morning, Olivia sat in her chambers, reviewing a pile of case files. Her work as a judge had always been her priority, but her advocacy efforts had added a new layer of purpose to her life. As she glanced at the clock, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus, her lawyer friend. "Community event tonight. They're dedicating it to you. Hope you can make it." Olivia smiled, touched by the gesture. She hadn't expected recognition, but it warmed her heart to know her efforts were appreciated. That evening, she arrived at the community center to find the room packed with people from all walks of life. Faces lit up as she walked in, and applause erupted. Olivia was taken aback but grateful. Marcus stepped forward to introduce her. "Tonight, we celebrate someone who stood up not just for herself, but for all of us." Judge Carter didn't just shine a light on injustice. She ignited a movement for change. Let's welcome her with the respect she deserves. As Olivia took the stage, she felt a wave of emotion. The room was filled with people who had supported her, shared their stories, and joined her in the fight for equality. She began her speech with gratitude, thanking everyone for their encouragement and commitment to change. "I never set out to be in the spotlight," she admitted. "That night, I just wanted to go home after a long day. But what happened showed me how much work we still have to do. This isn't about one person or one incident. It's about building a system that treats everyone with fairness and dignity." The crowd nodded in agreement, their energy palpable. Olivia continued, sharing updates on the reforms she had been working on. The mandatory bias training for officers had begun, and the Independent Oversight Board was already reviewing cases. She also highlighted the importance of community involvement, urging everyone to stay engaged. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Olivia said, "but together, we've proven that it is possible. We've taken the first steps, and now we must keep moving forward." After her speech, Olivia spent time talking with attendees. One woman approached her, holding the hand of her young son. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice trembling. "You've given me hope for his future." Olivia knelt to meet the boy's eyes. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Daniel," he replied shyly. "Well, Daniel," Olivia said with a warm smile, "always remember that your voice matters. Never be afraid to stand up for what's right." As the event wound down, Olivia reflected on how much had changed since that fateful night. The journey had been difficult, but it had also been deeply rewarding. She knew the work was far from over, but she was ready to keep fighting. Driving home, Olivia felt a renewed sense of purpose. The world wasn't perfect, but she believed in the power of people coming together to make it better. That belief, she knew, would guide her in the days ahead. The months following Judge Olivia Carter's incident with Officer Blake had been transformative for both her and the community. Reforms were underway, conversations about racial profiling were happening across the state, and Olivia had become a symbol of resilience and justice. Yet, despite the progress, Olivia often reflected on how much work was still needed. One afternoon, Olivia received an unexpected invitation. The police chief, who had been largely silent during the initial aftermath, asked to meet with her. Intrigued, Olivia agreed, though she remained cautious. When she arrived at the precinct, the chief greeted her with a firm handshake and an air of humility. "Judge Carter," he began, "I want to personally apologize for what happened that night. It never should have happened, and it's clear our department has a lot of work to do." Olivia listened, her expression calm but guarded. She appreciated the apology, but words alone weren't enough. The chief seemed to sense this and continued, "We've taken your recommendations seriously. The bias training you suggested has already started, and the Independent Oversight Board is fully operational. But I'd like to take it a step further. I want to invite you to help us rebuild trust with the community." Surprised but intrigued, Olivia asked, "What exactly do you have in mind?" The chief explained his idea of creating a community advisory panel that would include leaders like Olivia, law enforcement officers, and residents from all backgrounds. The goal was to foster open communication, address concerns directly, and work collaboratively on solutions. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was a start. "I'll consider it," Olivia said, her tone thoughtful. "But only if this isn't just for show. Real change requires commitment." "You have my word," the chief replied. In the weeks that followed, Olivia joined the advisory panel, using her legal expertise and personal experiences to guide the discussions. The meetings were often tense, with heated debates and differing perspectives, but Olivia remained a steady presence. Her ability to listen and mediate earned her the respect of both the community and law enforcement. One day, as Olivia walked out of a meeting, she was approached by a young officer. "Judge Carter," he said nervously, "I just wanted to thank you. I was in the bias training session you recommended, and it really opened my eyes. I'm committed to doing better." Olivia smiled, her heart swelling with hope. "Thank you for saying that. Change starts with individuals like you." The advisory panel's work began to bear fruit. New policies were implemented, trust between law enforcement and the community slowly grew, and stories of positive interactions began to replace the negative headlines. Olivia's efforts were making a tangible difference, and she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. One evening, as Olivia sat on her porch, watching the sunset, she thought back to the night of the traffic stop. It had been a painful experience, but it had also been a turning point, not just for her, but for so many others. She knew the fight for justice would never truly end, but she was proud of what they had accomplished together. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Olivia smiled to herself. She had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change, proving that even in the darkest moments, there is always the potential for light.